Welcome to the Borders and Globalization podcast. Welcome to our listeners. My name is Ben, and I'm working as a researcher for the Borders and Globalization Lab. I'm speaking from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen peoples in the Salish Sea region. As we know, borders are legal constructs, conventional lines on the map, landmarks on the ground, and a zone of control and violence. But borders are also an artistic object. Sometimes it is the border itself which is the support of a work of art. Other times, they appear in works of photography, comics, and movies. Speaking of movies, we could think of the film Terminal, which was inspired by a true story of an Iranian refugee stuck in a French airport for 18 years for problems with administrative papers. Today, we are going to talk about border film with Michael Deere, who has just published a book called Border Witness: Reimagining the US-Mexico Borderlands Through Film. Hello, Michael. Welcome on board. Great to see you.
Thank you very much, Ben. I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you.
The interview will be divided in 5 sections for the convenience of our listeners. First section about border and cinema, the state of play. To begin our interview, Michael, my first question concerns the border in cinema and the question of definition. What is border film?
Okay, I'll tell you quite quickly, but let me first thank you and also Emmanuel, Victor Conrad, and others at Borders and Globalization for this very kind information, invitation to this podcast. Thank you very much indeed. Let me start simply, and we'll complicate things quite quickly, I think, and say I regard border films as taking place in a borderland setting, and it has a thematic focus on lives of border people as well as their cross-border connections. That's the first cut into the whole wide world of border film.
Great. Thank you, Michael, for this definition. The border, as you know, is paradoxical. It divides, it connects, it separates, it unites. What specific representation of the borderlands are featured in border film?
Well, quite a lot. I mean, the book covers 100 years of filmmaking in Mexico and the United States. So there was an enormous amount of material, far more than I imagined when I began working on this topic. So let me just say as an opening, and regarding the early silent film days, it was amazing to me how quickly stereotypes about people and about situations emerged in film, and they have stayed by and large to the present day. For example, if you look at the US films, Mexican males were usually portrayed as lazy good-for-nothings or, Latin lovers. Mexican females were always exotic seductresses or damsels in distress. And they were usually awaiting rescue by a white gringo, for example. So in a film called Shorty's Trip to Mexico, the end of the film is achieved when Shorty carries his Mexican fiancée across the border and tells her, now you will be known henceforward as Mrs. Shorty, USA. That kind of stereotyping is lasted a long time. But if you go on for a moment, the Mexican perspective, they looked at American males as ugly Americans, basically, interested in very little than making money and believing in very not much at all. US females were then predatory blondes who were aggressively independent. At the same time, Mexicans portrayed their own women, Mexican women, as either as saintly mothers or as godless whores. Now, those kinds of stereotypes quickly got based, first of all, and quite largely in the Western film genre. These were cowboy and Indian films, which told stories later about the revolution, for example, in the same guise. But they were always set, almost always set in desert landscapes with exotic flora and fauna and towering mesas dominating the scenery. So it was actually watching these kinds of films on Saturday morning in a movie theater with Tom Mix and the Cisco Kid and people like that. That was my first exposure to Mexico and Mexicans. And really, I started seeing Mexico through film when I was really very young. So that was beginnings of the representational issue simply in Westerns and as quite crude stereotypes of either a hero or a villain or some kind of untouchable woman or a slut, putting it frankly. So those are the representations that we can begin with. And I think we will evolve more understanding of those representations as this conversation continues and I talk about other films.
Thank you, Michael, for this great overview. Let's move on to the second question. Your book, Border Witness, Reimagining the US-Mexico Borderlands Through Film. The border is also an issue of power, a theater where the state produces its authority. The word witness is from Old English witness, meaning attestation of fact, event. My question is this one. Where did the idea for this Border Witness book come from?
That's an interesting question to me and also a long question, a long answer. So I'll just give you a sketch. Since that childhood fascination with Mexico was born, I maintained it for the rest of my life. And in fact, when I first came to North America, I went to Uxmal, Chichen Itza. These were the American archaeological sites which somehow captured my imagination. And later, when I was older, I went on and to other sites in Veracruz, in Oaxaca. And then I spent time along the Baja California border when I moved to Los Angeles. And ultimately ended up taking a border-long trip on both sides in the early 2000s, which is like 4,000 miles, and really took me much longer than I thought it was going to take. As a result of these works, of these explorations rather, I published a book called Why Wars Won't Work in 2013. And the title will tell you what I think about walls. They simply don't work. But in that book, I examined the myriad ways in which both sides of the border were connected, and largely in a material sense. Going to school, going to work, crossing to see families and friends, crossing for recreational purposes. In fact, living your lives as everyday people, but being separated by an international boundary. One of the things that I didn't deal with and always wanted to deal more with was the question of a cognitive awareness of what living in this borderland territory meant to the people themselves. You know, how would they see their connections? How do they organize their lives? So I needed to find out how these shared histories, how these common identities, and how these languages and attachment to land all came together to define a situation in the borderlands, the US-Mexico borderlands, where people would say to me that they identified more with their own borderland nation than they did with their own home nations, with either the United States or with Mexico. And that degree of connection led me to feel I needed to find a way to collect evidence about mental maps that allowed us to talk about trans-border or even post-border environments. And it seemed to me after a little while that this would be an impossible task. It's just asking too much. Then, and this is the end of the story for now, I'd been watching border films for as long as I can remember. Suddenly it came to me that exactly the kind of evidence that I wanted was tied up in filmic, cinematic representations of the borderlands. From the early silents, which were crude but fascinating, through all the marvelous westerns by John Ford, etc., etc. They all portrayed a consistent landscape, a consistent set of peoples in rapidly evolving circumstances over at least a century, and even more if you consider the historical films. At that moment, I knew I had my evidence. I knew I had my evidence for what I was looking at. But I need to say one more thing, because I turned myself into a witness. And that happened really through the works of James Baldwin and The Devil Makes Work, a remarkable work of film criticism and perception about the role of racism in American films, the place and the representation of race in American films. And the point that Baldwin made that has really hit home to me, he said, when asked to consider how he judged the films for their authenticity, for their veracity, his reply was almost invariably, it is because I saw it. It was because I witnessed it.
Wow.
And he did what I ended up doing, because I've spent 3 or more decades in Mexico now. I used my own knowledge, albeit not native knowledge. I wasn't born there. But I used that knowledge as a check, as a way to judge the truth, if you want, of what the films were portraying, to the extent that they jived with my own experiences. It's a very idiosyncratic, very personal way of doing things. But in my studies in geohumanities, I've always been obsessed by, you must tell me what your evidence was so I know the basis for the judgments that you make. It might be statistical, it might be photographic, it might be sheer pleasure, preference, whatever it is, I need to know so I know what we're talking about. So I brought this idea about knowing Mexico from my childhood, and it met at one point James Baldwin, who told me that my films, my film background, my film learnings were ideal vehicles for the collection of evidence about what I came to be called the third nation between the United States and Mexico.
Thank you. Great, Michael. Thank you very much for sharing all this background. As you have said, this book is also a sharing of your personal experience. You did research work, you did travels. In a few words, Michael, what has been, in more details, your experience, personal experience about borders?
Well, briefly, I'm a true border scholar, like you are, in the sense that we understand the borders are much more than lines, imaginary lines drawn on maps. And there's a geography about it as well, because the border extends very far and deeply into our own nations. Los Angeles is a border city. Monterrey in Nuevo León is a border city, although they're hundreds of miles from the border. So when I first went there, my experience was wrong. My experience that I was bringing to it was that I would be looking at drug trafficking, I would be looking at national security, I would be looking at immigration. And yes, those are big and important topics, but I was immediately bowled over by the people at the border, the way they lived their lives, and the connections between both sides of the border. And it was that experience which really made me who I am, and also gave me my program for research and investigation and teaching. It is, as you said, a border as a connective tissue, not as a separating divide. People I know in Mexico very often say they forget which side of the border they're on.
Yeah.
Such is the commonality of their experiences. Now, of course, just to bring it quickly up to date in a sentence or two, the militarization of the border, the fortifications, and so on have made it tremendously difficult for people to live, interrupting communities which have existed for centuries before Mexico and the United States even existed. So I'm amazed by how border people, the tenacity of border people in putting up with this occupation. And also amazed by how much civility still exists on the border. It is a wonderful place. And just to give you a brief example, in my book, I talk about the US-Mexico borderlands, and I give my address at the end of the book as the United Borderland States. That's a measure of my degree of affection and identification with that area. That's my experience.
Thank you, Michael. About your book is divided into 3 parts: origins, fusions, and witness. What are the chapters about, and what are the key messages of your book, finally?
This is a very good question. I set boundaries to myself, but I didn't go into the project knowing them. I just read, and ironically enough, this was during the COVID period, so I had a lot of more time than I usually do. But I started reading books and accounts, critical studies, newspapers, and so on, just on an ad hoc basis. I went back to 100 years of film by accident, because that's where the early silence started, and et cetera, et cetera. I came right to the present day. And then when I did that, I thought, if I'm going to actually talk about the border, I should understand Mexican films too. So I went back to the start, and I did my best to learn about Mexican films, which incidentally is not so easy, because something like, I think, 80% of the Mexican film archive was destroyed in a fire in the late 1980s in Mexico City. And all researchers now, historians, etc., are burdened by this tragic loss in the Mexican film archives, because I'll let you into a little secret. The films were fantastic.
Of course.
We underestimate the Mexican film and television industry immensely. And whatever we had in Hollywood in those early days in the 30s and so on, Mexico had their equivalents in Churubusco City there in Mexico City. So I'm digressing. I started with silence. I looked then at what you might call the golden age of border films, beginning with the birth of border films around the middle of the 20th century, and then proceeding into the present day in the 21st. I'm going to talk more about this a little bit later in detail, but I'll just keep it at this level. There are histories about both countries so that you can understand what the films are talking about. There are discussions of the Mexican and the US film industries, so that you can understand certainly the corrective understanding of how important the Mexican film industry was and is. And then in the later sections of the book, there are individual chapters which look at themes. And I'll give you one example. One of the most important thematic emphases in the book is about the changing role of women in film. It was quite staggering to me to read that and to find out how it emerged. I'll give you one brief example. Mexican film called Miss Bala was made in the early part of the 2000s. And it was a tragic story of women being forced to traffic, to carry drugs and other things into the United States. And the woman who was the heroine in that film, the best thing that happened to her was that she was, and the only thing that measured her success was that she was still standing and alive at the end of the film. She was a terrified exhausted, finished human being. When that film was made 10 years later in the United States, Miss Bala was now a superheroine. She was an agent for the CIA, and she went around killing drug cartel owners, et cetera, et cetera. It was a complete wreckage compared with the early film, but it did represent the way women were being represented, the way women changed, the way representations of women were changing all the time on the film. I brought all this together in what I called the genre, the border film genre. And in the end of the book, we look at 100 years of film, and we look at the encapsulations of the history, both in the industry and in both countries. And I manufacture my understanding of what the genre is about. I was working at that by then with about 130 films, although I'd seen a lot more. And I boiled that down to 72 key films which define the genre. Only then was I ready to start thinking about how I could use this further. But it was a delightful journey and a wonderful experience. I was ready. By the time I finished the book, I was ready to start it again.
Great, Michael. Thank you for this presentation of your book. And
I didn't talk about key messages. I can say something about that if you want to.
Of course. Share with us.
They were simple. And sometimes they were confirming, and sometimes they were new to me. Strong connections across the US-Mexico borderlands, as other borderlands in the world, they've been existing way before our current nation-state boundaries. Strong connections, incidentally, then means positive things and negative things, right? In some ways, war is a very negative, but establishes a connection between two nations. So it's that long-going, deep time connectivity across the borderlands, which weren't borderlands in the past, which struck me very strongly. Okay. The real-world importance of the borders cannot be underestimated. The US-Mexico border is home to about 10 million people. Over $1 billion worth of trade crosses that border every single day. And our global security depends on what happens in that small strip of land. These insights are reflected in the films, are commented on in the films. Now, I'll give a few more examples a little bit later on. Yes. But in addition to which, there's a normative dimension here in that the representations in border film happen to, they talk about peaceful existence, they talk about collaboration over time, but they're also commentary. They're also criticism of what transborder communities are, have been, and can be. And it's that critical dimension, that forensic parsing of our real and imagined past. It becomes to me, I mean, it's like a wonderful toolkit to open up what the borderlands means. And it tells us too, the borderland people have more lessons to tell us in the rest of the country, in Mexico and the United States and even elsewhere, about how to live our lives properly in peaceful coexistence, in harmony, collegiality, and in cooperative ways. I mean, it's a place of amazing instruction for the rest of us. And you get that in your films, especially when you see the way films will comment on a piece of the world at a particular time, and that's actually quite wonderful. It's a forensic tool that I didn't imagine and foresee.
Great, Michael. Thank you for this presentation of your book and specifically about these key messages. We enter now in our third section, the section about border film and border studies. Borders are often seen as lines and walls, as you just said. tools that divide geography and populations. But is it possible to construct other representation of the border? For instance, aren't borders also zones of cultural mixing? And you have just spoken about that. If yes, do you have some good examples?
Yes. But I'll talk about some examples, but I'll explain the way I see this. Yes, of course, there are so many different ways of mixing. And so a lot of my book is, in a lot of my work, the keywords are about hybridity and about fusion. So without going into any kind of strong academic scholarly detail, there's a natural tendency in the world, it seems, because fusion and mixing is like part of the normal sequence of human life and flora and fauna, about the evolution of even the planet. And meetings of populations, be they plants, animals, or humans, are characterized by convergence and mixing, what we'd say in Spanish, mestizaje, the way those collisions occur and the way convergence brings change. That's a universal feature in world living, I think. And so that, in a sense, everything is a hybrid. And everything is a cultural, economic, political, linguistic mixing, as you said in your introduction a moment ago. And then if I can be a little bit academic for a moment, I mean, I did not write an academic book. I did not write a book on formal film theory or formal film criticism. I deliberately was unpacking it with sound scholarship, obviously, behind it, but trying to write it in a way which would appeal to the general public. But if you look at what happens in the book, any border scholar who's talking today about debordering or rebordering, etc., are reading about this in my book. The portrait in the film Traffic, for example, a very famous film in 2000, which I think began the golden age of border film. It was actually a film about globalizing of the drug trafficking industry, drug production, drug trafficking, drug movement, drug consumption. It was actually quite spectacular as a film. As a film was important because it was a mega Hollywood production, huge stars, huge amounts of money going. The first one that happened in. Incidentally, it drew on I think it was a British-German television series also called Traffic, which showed these global connections better because it went to Pakistan and Afghanistan where the product was being grown, and why it was inevitable in those places that people would turn to that to be able to live. So that kind of film, like Traffic, was so good in terms of demonstrating a global connectivity that I think other geopolitical scholars would find very appealing and instantly recognizable. But I'll just say one more thing on this, because it's a very, very large topic.
Of course.
My focus in this book, and I don't usually speak this way, but my focus was resolutely empirical in this book. I was determined to let the films speak for themselves and then compare that with what I knew. That's the logic of the president. I let the films speak for themselves because I wanted to see the people, how they conducted their lives and how they dealt with political fallout, both in real life and in film. And it was hugely significant then to me that I would read James Baldwin and I would agree to be a witness and use my direct experience and knowledge as a basis for judging the veracity of the films and the veracity of the history, if it came to that. There's a lot more that can be said about that. But since I didn't talk about the theory in depth in the book, I've said enough of it now in this conversation.
Thank you, Michael. Border studies have built many concepts to study their object. We have been able to speak about bordering processes, as you just said, also debordering, but also about border performativity or border work, etc. About your book, in which registers of border studies is your book situated?
Well, I've said a little bit about that now, because, and I will say more about it as the conversation goes on. But I've been concerned to understand not specifically the theoretical construct, although I've focused then on a different set, perhaps, that others have done so. So a starting point for my work very much is the concept of nation, the concept of nationalism, the concept of nation states, all representing varying degrees of awareness, identification, a group collectivity, and then the manifestation as a political space. This is the fascinating piece. It intersects, of course, in interesting ways with the individual. Because here I have a group of individuals who are living in a particular place where there are already cross-border examples of connection and coexistence. That the Tohono O'odham Reservation Nation, at the U.S.-Mexico border still exists as a kind of quasi-independent organization, just overstepping the border. So all those things count a great deal for me. But at the end of the day, in this particular instance, much more than I normally do, as I said, I became an empiricist again. I just looked at what was there. I traveled and I listened. And I did not worry about whether or not it fitted into particular theoretical constructs. I don't see myself as making a contribution in those directions. But I'm sure that if other people looked at this book, which didn't forcefully present my own theoretical presuppositions, they too might get carried away on the empirical wave, as it were, and come up with the same kind of conviction that I did. At the end of the book, however, I am translating these understandings into some recommendations about experiments in local democracy. Because I think to elaborate the nation idea a little bit more, there is a third nation in this space between the two nations where autonomy can be practiced and should be encouraged by various means to develop a local democratic organization. And political scientists and geopoliticians have written more about this than I have, and their work is just completely convincing to me. I like it.
Thank you, Michael, for sharing with us all your experience about border film and border studies and your discussion about your book. As you said, everything is hybrid. And let's move on to section 4 now, about Mexican cinema, American cinema, and their linkages with the border. We imagine that there was also an evolution of the boundary object in American and Mexican cinema. Maritime border and port of entry, land border, internal and external border, social borders, though, but also indigenous borders, open border, violent borders. And from obstacle to pathway, from scenic and panoramic composition, how have film representations of the borderlands evolved over the time?
I really think that's one of the central questions the evidence in this book addresses. I'm not quite sure that you would have the same interpretations as me, but that's not the point. I'll just say simply that when you look at the way the representations have worked, the films have actually created people and scenes, it goes quickly beyond the stereotypes that I began with earlier in this conversation. Happily, I'm very glad to see some of those stereotypes disappear. But if you recall from when I said that, the early silent films were basically Westerns, cowboy and Indian films, and they were predominantly films in which the border acted as a background. It was an attractive scenery, it was an exotic scenery, and really any kind of film could be filmed there. Westerns, thrillers, romances, it was just beautiful and exotic, so it was fine. The origins of the real origins of border film lay in the mid-20th century. At that time, the emphasis in films was less cowboys and Indians, and it was more on migration. Migration quickly seized people's attention in the film world, and two important films came out. Border Incident in the United States in 1949, and Espaldas Mojados, which means wetbacks, in a few years later in 1955 in Mexico. And they dealt with the object tremendously differently. The American film was about police collaboration across the border to prevent exploitation of migrants. It was, in a sense, it was a very forward-looking liberal kind of agenda, and a scientific agenda, that good policing, good communications, et cetera, could conquer any problem brought about any criminals. So this was very successful. It's quite a horrific film in many ways, but it's absolutely fundamental in terms of understanding the border film genre. Equally well, wetbacks, Espaldas Mojados in the Mexican side of the line, presented the Mexican migrant as a heroic figure.
Okay.
So this well-meaning, strong, passionate person goes to the United States to work, and in so doing helps Mexico, helps his families, etc., etc. And the migrants in the films who are subject to an intensely exaggerated warfare as soon as they approach the United States, it's very moving, very convincing. But you also must understand that the film started with a warning that the U.S. federal government insisted on, which said, "Do not do this. This is dangerous."
Yeah.
And then in the film, when Mexican migrants swam across the river, they were fired on immediately by guns and just killed before they could land in America. So that the warning that you're going, they were, in a word, they shot first and didn't even bother to ask questions afterwards. So it was a tremendous difference. It's a shocking difference between the optimistic ways in which technology and science and policing on both sides collaboratively can solve crime, and the other one where the Mexican laborer is a heroic figure advancing on a hostile nation to try to work and better himself. It's usually men that are occurring at that time. So that was a big switch. That's a marvelous juxtaposition. Migration was followed, however, quickly by crime.
Yeah.
The whole theme of noir films in the 50s in the United States and later quickly found their way into border films. Touch of Evil is the key film here with Orson Welles and Charlton who had recently done The Robe or some Christian epic, was now in brownface, playing a Mexican policeman alongside Janet Leigh, who was this blonde, beautiful American wife. It was a mixed marriage, and it's interesting that miscegenation, which is what this was, wasn't mentioned once in the film. And even the earliest films glossed over miscegenation as something that was purely trivial, not even worth mentioning. So the moralities were very different then, but those are great films. Touch of Evil is a monumental achievement. To just quickly finish this story, after middle of the century, toward the end of the century, border films started to appear very quickly and in larger numbers. And that was because the migration problem was running into large difficulties. The amount of illegal crossings were enormous. There were reasons for that, and I won't go into them right now. But there were the stories of migrants came to the fore. The moral and political, economic dilemmas they faced were examined in a series of actually quite brilliant films. Looking at life on the other side, I'm talking about films like Lone Star or El Norte and so on. They were just classic films. There was also some incredibly silly films like Born in East LA, where Cheech Marin gets deported accidentally and spends the rest of his life trying to get back. And so that's the rest of the film, trying to get back into the United States. And then finally, in terms of how these representations evolve, by the time you got to around the year 2000, the narco films, the drug films were dominant. And there were some totally brilliant films. And the only comparison that I'll make was between Traffic, which is a forensic film on the drug trafficking industry and its impact, and then Sicario, which appeared about 10 years later, where the fundamental confession was that we lost the drug. America and the United States lost the drug war, and now we're looking at the consequences of that. And it's trench warfare. It's an amazingly powerful film showing how the drug wars had been lost and how cartels really dominated aspects of life in both countries. So that's a very long answer. I'm sorry. But going from Westerns, migration, crime, life on the other side, and Narcolandia, I think that those are the big changes in the representations of these films.
Thank you, Michael, for sharing all your knowledge and your passion for all this culture and the movies about borderlands and borders. Michael, you make a case for border film genre. What does this consist of?
Well, I think this is kind of a desire on my part to organize my knowledge, to understand it. I started writing this book purely writing essays to myself, and then they grew. So as I said, I have about half the films in my genre collection are Mexican, about half are US films. There are 72 films that define, if you look at them, you'll have a historical account of the evolution of border films for the past 100 years. The genre is important in all film studies as an idea about classifying films would have similar styles and treatment topics. It's the style and the themes and topics that define a genre. So Westerns, for example, or space science fiction, they're immediately recognizable by film, by director, by content, and they're actually used as a coherent framework to talk to audiences. They're used by critics to speak to people. They're used by you and I when we recommend a film to each other. It's a romantic comedy. or it's a war film.
Yeah.
And we don't need to say anything else. It's a very convenient shorthand, but it also has an effect of legitimizing a field of study or a field of art.
Yeah.
So when you see film included in, whatever newspapers you read, alongside painting, alongside dance and things like that, I mean, filmmaking is able to make a claim for artistic status, something in the realm of creativity, which it fully deserves. I'm not disputing it. But it's a classificatory exercise. It enables us to talk about films and their evolution in certain ways. So we have spoken now about origins. We've spoken about the golden age of border films, and we've also seen situations where in border films where an old age, senescence starts in the genre. So, for example, in part of the border film world, very soon the films became extraordinarily violent. They became like slasher movies, that the only thing that was of concern was who died and how died. How did they die? And some films, mostly Mexican, I think, and I'm sorry to say that, and that's not prejudice, but they're mostly Mexican. They just covered ways in which a killer, an assassin, different ways. How many different ways in one film can you kill a migrant? So it's groups of migrants crossing the desert, and one by one they'd be picked off until one heroic feature, one heroic character gets him. They're pointless. They're like a large reservoir of slasher films which have occurred in the past. So the border film genre idea helps us to understand, I think, helps us to look at the films as a whole and to learn more about what they're telling us. I think that's what they're about, for me anyway.
Thank you again, Michael. We enter in our last section about the scope of the analysis related to the border and films relations. Mexico is one of the places where border art was born, and many border artists act to resist, to try to transform representations. How can films and cinema help us better understand the phenomenon of borders and bordering processes?
Well, this is the biggest challenge, and I'm glad you've kept it until last, Ben. I think what my experience has been that looking at films has made me rethink history and made me understand the present dilemmas that the border faces better, and also points even to some kind of resolution that I might not otherwise have seen. It's actually quite powerful if you state it that way. I mean, I'm revisiting history through film. I'm reconsidering our present dilemmas as a consequence of film, and I'm seeing solutions that I might not have seen without film.
Okay,
that's good. That's hot stuff. And I think you can see it. Can I give one example, just briefly?
Yes.
In the film Lone Star, which came out in the 80s, I recall, there was a portrait along the Rio Bravo of generations in a small border town. The previous generations were totally racist, and the present generations were trying to revise and revisit and learn again from eliminating racism. And that was an extremely well done film, where that effort towards looking at situating the history, looking at the way racism found its expression, oftentimes in killing people in its midsection, and then resolving the dilemma at a single level. single person level where two people come together for reasons which I can't go into right now. But at the end of the conversation, one's Mexican, one's American, and they look at each other. And the woman says to the man, "Forget the Alamo. Forget that seminal battle between the US and Mexico in the old days. You can dump all that BS and we can get on with our lives." And the portrayal of that is actually quite uplifting and very convincing in what you normally call a Western kind of approach to filming. There are other films that force a greater look at the way politics operates at the borders. And I'll just say lastly that I think that you can see ways in which films also act behind the camera,
Yeah,
to organize change. You know, the fights over the Oscars recently, and diversity in the Oscars is a good example here, perhaps. But in the filming of The Wild Bunch, for example, in 1969 by Sam Peckinpah, Peckinpah really loved Mexico. And when he pulled all these people from Mexico to work on his film, he found on the first day of filming that Mexicans had been told to go to a different place to eat from the white actors. He was appalled, and that changed. That was changed by the end of the day. He changed the rule that segregated Mexicans from whites in the canteen. And the other obvious example, which I mentioned briefly, is the way in which women are advancing in filmmaking in both countries. It's slow, but it is occurring, and that's a behind the camera thing too. So it's very easy to say, oh, films can't influence anybody. Well, but they do, and the way we make films influences people too. And the way I think we can rethink the self-government and local democratic experiments in the border is just waiting to be exploited by us. And it's from film that's coming. It's a very powerful thing.
Of course, I agree with you. And two light questions. If I was a student of film, Michael, which films in your border film genre do you recommend? And as a movie goer, which border films are your favorites?
Well, I can recommend classics, but not like them, and I can like films that are not classics. So I'll be kind of eclectic. But I've mentioned some of the classics. If you're going to start this seriously, I think looking at Border Incident and Espaldas Mojadas, Wetbacks, they're the benchmarks for the beginning. Then you can go on to Lone Star, El Norte, and Traffic. I've also mentioned them as three very, very fundamental things. And today, there's just a proliferation of new things. I'll just mention two different films. Born in East LA, which I mentioned, I think, which was just the silliest film ever. I love it. So it's a favorite film as well as a classic. And the other one that I really like too is also deserving of some sort of classic status is Sleep Dealer, which was by Alex Rivera. And that was one of the few what you'd call science fiction or fantasy films that are on the list. It's not a genre or subgenre that's attracted much people, but it's extremely clever. And it shows the world where the US-Mexico border is entirely sealed and what the consequences are. The consequences are quite drastic and dramatic. And I will not give the tale of the story away. As for fun, Touch of Evil is brilliant, and it's also a classic. If we really branch out, we've got Machete. Rodriguez, who is a famous Southwesterner in Texas. He's very funny. He's very imaginative. He's also can be very violent and very sexual in his films. But Machete is a masterpiece. If you don't believe me, just take a look at the film. Born in East LA, I mentioned. Sicario is brilliant. Sicario is that film where it was declared quite forcefully that the drug wars had been lost and what the consequences are. If you put Traffic and Sicario together, it's just chilling. And then the last one, if you get a chance to see it, try to see Emeritus Carne y Arena, means flesh and dust, or flesh and sand. It's an immersive feature film. It's not a feature film. It's an immersive experience of crossing the border, and it's terrifying. It might be important as the way we'll experience films in the future. Nobody knows what the future of film is. But that film really, really knocked me out. When I left it, I'm not going to give anything away about it, but you join the experience of being a migrant. When I left it, I had to disappear into a part of the museum where it was being shown and hide, because I simply wasn't ready to come out into the real world after that. Made me feel as if I actually had been a migrant and I just arrived in the United States. And there are so many good films out there. And if you take a look at the short lists that I've produced in the book, you pretty much soon quickly find things that will satisfy you.
Great, Michael. I have an ultimate question for you. My last question is more comparative. How does coverage of the Mexican-US border in film compare with other borderland films elsewhere in the world?
All right, that's a very large, very tall order, but it's a very good question because, people do things differently in other places. It took me a long time to know Mexico and to speak authoritatively about other countries in this regard. I can't do that. I will not pretend to do that. The other thing that I will also mention to you as an immediate kickback is that I did only fictional films. There is a world of documentary film out there that's equally good to feature or narrative films, and we can't talk about them now. But since you're in Canada, the immortal border film in Canada is Canadian Bacon. That is by Michael Moore, right? It came out in 1995, I think. John Candy was in it, and a number of other really excellent Canadian film stars, comics. It's about the it's about the invasion of Canada from the United States. And I'm laughing at it because it is such a funny film. It's immortal, and it is on a par with anything I've seen anywhere else. On the other hand, more seriously, was Frozen River. It was a film by Courtney Hunt in 2008, and it was about the St. Lawrence River and trafficking of migrants and drugs across the river. I think it was around Cornwall Island near Ottawa. And was it the Akwesasne tribe? No, nation. Forgive me, I can't remember, and I'm sure I'm pronouncing it badly. I apologize. But those are really good films. Canadian Bacon is funny, and Frozen River is realist in an extreme. It's a superb film. Understand that those two films are not so far from some of the U.S. Mexican concerns too, but Canadians do things differently. The nation with the most to offer, or the group of nations with the most to offer, I think is in the Israeli-Palestine situation, which wouldn't surprise you for one moment. There's a filmmaker named Amos Gitai, who is probably the most prolific director of films about the border in the world. He's honored greatly. He lives in Paris now, and there are so many films by him that I hesitate to mention even one. But Amos Gitai, Gitai, is phenomenal. I will say less about him than I should, but that's enough. At the same time, in the Israeli-Palestine situation, there's a tremendous amount of fun and comedy. My favorite is Tel Aviv on Fire, by a man called Zorabi. It came out in 2019, which has got to be the funniest border film, or up there, one of the 5 funniest border films. But dealing with a serious topic. If you want serious, look for Lemon Tree, which is about a war between Palestine and Israel. And then lastly, just briefly, because this is a huge topic, I started to watch more Latin American films, and some of those are just gut punches. Bacurau is a Brazilian film, and it's about a small rural community. It's not actually a border community, but the border comes in because people come from America and other countries to visit this community, and they're there because it's a theme park. They're there to assassinate the people in the villages. People in the villages don't like that. It's a staggering film. It's terrifying, but so is Nuevo Orden, New Order. That's can't remember. I think it might be not Brazilian. That doesn't matter. There's not enough time. New Order. It's in English. That's about authoritarian governments, and that one should not be watched unless you're prepared to see some extremely violent things. I couldn't watch it, but that's why I shut my eyes. But I did see it. So powerful. And then more directly is Pájaros de Verano, Birds of Passage or Summer Birds or something like that, which was, I think, another Brazilian film, and I didn't look these up. I'm sorry, I'm not ready for this. But it's Birds of Summer. It's about what happens in a community when the cartels take over, leaving behind, and these were indigenous people, which makes it doubly interesting. And their way of life was predictably completely wrecked, as they either rejected it and died, or they absorbed the ways of the cartels, and they lost their souls, and they lost their land, and they lost their people. That's a film taken up, a theme taken up by a number of other films in the United States and Mexico. I mentioned just one name, Identifying Features in English, Señas Particulares in Spanish. But you know, the conclusion, and this is a very brief summary, Ben, but the conclusion is that there are some terrific films out there in these various countries. And I do believe that they deal with these problems by and large in very different ways, with very different eyes, which makes them doubly, triply worthy of watching. Nobody can deal, I know from experience, nobody could do with the films of 2 countries over 100 years and remain sane. And the idea of looking into all these other places as well. But as you can tell from the films I mentioned, I don't resist the temptation. And I think it's totally worthwhile and highly recommended.
Thank you, Michael, very much for your knowledge and your culture about border films. And thank you for participating in our podcast series. It was a very great discussion on border film and generally about culture of films and cultures of borderlands and lives of borderlanders. Thank you again, Michael dear, for your participation.
Thank you very much indeed, Ben, and thank you to all my Canadian friends who actually supplied me with titles of Canadian films so I could learn more about Canadian border films, and you should all watch them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. This was the Borders in Globalization podcast. Today we were with Michael Deere. Thank you for your attention and see you soon for the next issue. Hasta luego. Bye-bye.